There's a secret Colombia buried under decades of silence, a secret so dark that even those who know it would rather never speak of it. For years, no one dared to tell the truth about what really happened to the children of the most feared man on the continent. Because sometimes the worst punishment is not dying, it's surviving. It's waking up every morning knowing you carry a last name the entire world curses. It's living hidden, hunted, forever marked by crimes you never committed. And what they had to do to stay alive was more terrible than any fortune lost. In the 1980s, Medellin wasn't just a city, it was a battlefield disguised as paradise. For some, it was a living hell burning every night under bombs and bullets. For others, it was a crystal bubble where money flowed like water and power could be felt in the air. The Escobars lived at the center of that bubble. They had everything money could buy. Mansions with Olympic-sized pools, private jets parked on clandestine airstrips, personal zoos with animals brought from Africa, luxuries that defied all logic. But behind each indulgence was a truth no one wanted to admit, that all that power was built on blood, betrayal, and the most primitive fear a human being can feel. And even though the children didn't understand where all of it came from, their bodies somehow knew something was wrong. Power born from fear never lasts long enough to protect the children of the monster who built it. That was the invisible tragedy of the Escobars. They lived surrounded by bodyguards armed to the teeth, 3-meter walls, security systems straight out of a spy movie. But none of it could protect them from the inevitable. The fall, the collapse everyone knew would come, but no one dared to mention out loud. Because in that house, talking about the future was dangerous. It meant acknowledging that their present was a lie, a temporary illusion that could vanish at any moment. The children grew up inside that brutal contradiction. On one hand, they had everything. On the other, they had nothing. They had toys, but no real friends. They had gourmet meals, but couldn't go out for ice cream like normal kids. They had a father who adored them, but that same father was the reason they could never have a normal life. And even though Pablo Escobar tried to separate them from his business, tried to keep them inside a bubble of innocence, reality always found its way in. Through the fearful looks of people, the whispers from the staff, the nights when their father disappeared without explanation and returned days later with an expression the children couldn't decode, but that chilled their blood. Then came the beginning of the end. The Colombian government, pressured by the United States, decided Pablo Escobar had to fall, no matter the cost, no matter the collateral damage. And the first to pay that price were the ones least responsible, his family. Because when you're at war with an invisible man, you attack what he loves most. And Pablo Escobar loved his children more than his empire, more than his money, more than his own life, and his enemies knew it. On December the 2nd, 1993, at 3:15 in the afternoon, Pablo Escobar died on a rooftop in Medellin. He was shot 14 times. His body collapsed over the sun-heated tiles as the entire city heard the echo of gunfire. And in that moment, the most brutal persecution his children would ever face began, because the world wanted revenge. And if they couldn't take it on the dead father, they would take it on the living children. What came next was a hell no one has ever documented accurately. The Escobar family was left completely exposed. No protection, no immediate resources, no one willing to help them for fear of retaliation. And the Colombian government made a decision that would mark them forever. They abandoned them, completely, left them like lambs among starving wolves. For months, the entire family lived locked inside a Bogota hotel, the Tequendama Hotel, a place that should have been a temporary refuge, became their prison. They were kept on the 13th floor, watched, threatened. Every phone call was a death threat. Every sound in the hallway made them jump in terror. The threats were explicit, detailed, horrifying. Los Pepis, a paramilitary group funded by Pablo's enemies, sent clear messages. We will dismember the children. We will rape the widow. We will erase the name Escobar from the face of the earth. The night they finally escaped Colombia felt like a scene from a horror film. They boarded a private plane in darkness, with no real luggage, no valid documents, no idea where they were being taken. They only knew one thing. Staying in Colombia meant dying. They arrived in Mozambique, a country shattered by years of civil war, chaotic, barely functioning. No steady electricity. Clean water was a luxury. Tropical diseases lurked everywhere. And the children of the richest man in South America suddenly learned what real poverty meant. The kind that hurts in your stomach. The kind that wakes you in the night wondering if tomorrow you'll have something to eat. But anonymity never came. Within months, international journalists tracked them down. Sensationalist tabloids published blurry photos of the family on the streets of Maputo. With the photos came diplomatic pressure. The United States did not want them anywhere in the world. Mozambique gave in and expelled the family once again. Homeless, stateless, unwanted. They tried Brazil, rejected before even landing. Tried Ecuador, accepted for weeks, then forced out under threat of extradition. Tried Peru, Venezuela, South Africa, everywhere. No. And with each rejection, their desperation grew. It was during these months of flight that the infamous incident happened. The night they burned money to survive. They were hiding in a cabin in the mountains somewhere in Central America, a location they never revealed publicly. They had managed to take some of Pablo's hidden cash, bundles of $100 bills sealed in plastic bags. But that night, the mountain cold was deadly. They had no firewood, nothing to ignite a flame. Maria Victoria, the mother, was shaking so violently that Juan Pablo feared she would die of hypothermia. So he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He took the bundles of cash and burned them one by one. The money that had bought empires, financed private armies, corrupted entire governments, now served only to keep 3 freezing fugitives alive in the middle of nowhere. And as the flames consumed the bills, Juan Pablo understood something fundamental. All the money in the world is worthless if you don't have a safe place to exist. After nearly 2 years of rejection, one country finally accepted them. Argentina. They arrived in Buenos Aires in 1995, and the first thing they did was legally change their identities. Juan Pablo Escobar no longer existed. He was now Sebastian Marroquin. Maria Victoria also changed her name. Manuela disappeared entirely from public view. With these new names, with documents eventually legalized, they tried to become invisible. Sebastian tried to study. He enrolled in university to become an architect. He wanted to build things. If his father had destroyed so many lives, he would build. If his father had sowed death, he would sow beauty. For years, he managed to stay anonymous, attended classes, made friends who had no idea who he really was, went to bars, tried to live like any young man in his 20s. But that illusion collapsed in 2009. Argentine police arrested Sebastian and his mother, accusing them of money laundering, suspicious bank accounts, supposed ties to drug trafficking. Weak accusations, no solid evidence. But the message was clear. They would never stop being suspects. They spent months detained, interrogated repeatedly. And although they were eventually released for lack of evidence, something broke inside Sebastian that night. The idea that he could ever be normal. That's when he made the most important decision of his life. He stopped hiding. He chose to face his past head on, and he decided to do something no one expected. Speak. Tell his story, not to justify his father, but to free himself from him. In 2014, he published Pablo Escobar, My Father, and in that book, he did something revolutionary. He apologized, not on behalf of his father, but on his own. Because even though he never pulled a trigger, he knew he had lived off blood-stained money. He knew his childhood of luxury was built on the suffering of thousands. The book caused a storm. Some called him opportunistic, others saw bravery. Then he began to travel, giving talks, telling his story at universities, forums, public events. And in each presentation, he did the same. He apologized. He looked people in the eyes and said, "I didn't choose to be Pablo Escobar's son, but I choose what to do with that reality, and I choose to ask forgiveness." In 2016, something extraordinary happened. Sebastian returned to Colombia for the first time in more than 20 years. He met with victims of his father, children of murdered police officers, survivors of bombings, families shattered by the Medellin cartel. And at every meeting he listened, without defending himself, without arguing, just listened. One woman, the mother of a murdered police officer, stared at him with such hatred that Sebastian thought she might hit him. She remained silent, a silence heavier than any insult. Then after several minutes, she finally said, You didn't kill my son, but you carry the name of the man who did, and I will never be able to look at you without seeing your father." And she walked away. No forgiveness. No reconciliation. But there were others who surprised him, like a man whose brother died in the Avianca bombing. He listened quietly, then hugged Sebastian tightly, tearfully, and said, "Thank you for coming. Thank you for not forgetting. Thank you for being different." In 2019, the documentary Sins of My Father premiered. Sebastian visited the exact places where his father committed his worst crimes. The Das building destroyed by a car bomb that killed more than 70 people. The neighborhood where another bomb killed presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan. At each site, Sebastian stopped, closed his eyes, and tried to feel the weight of what had happened there. At the end of the documentary, an elderly survivor confronted him, a man whose face still bore scars from an explosion. He looked directly at Sebastian and said, "You are not your father, but you can't forget that his blood runs in your veins." Sebastian spent years in therapy trying to process all this. One of the hardest truths he had to accept was that both versions of his father were real. Pablo did love him, but that love was never enough to stop him. Pablo chose power over the safety of his family. Meanwhile, Manuela chose another path: total silence. After her father's death, she was deeply traumatized. She developed severe mental health issues, depression, anxiety, panic attacks that left her paralyzed for days. And unlike her brother, she never wanted to speak publicly. She just wanted to disappear. And in many ways, she did. Sebastian has said in interviews that he respects his sister's decision completely. He knows everyone copes with trauma differently. That while he needed to speak to heal, she needed silence. But there was something the world never knew. Something Sebastian revealed only a few years ago. Something that changed everything. He had kept letters from his father, letters Pablo wrote in the final days of his life, when he already knew death was inevitable. And in those letters, there were no escape plans, no instructions about hidden money, only apologies. "Forgive me for the last name I gave you," one letter said. "Forgive me for the nights you will be afraid. Forgive me for the places you'll never be able to enter. Forgive me for making you my son. If I could go back, I would choose another path. A path where you could be happy, where you could have friends without fear, where you could shout your name without shame. But it's too late now, and the only thing I can give you are these words: that I love you, that I always loved you, and that my greatest failure was not falling to my enemies. It was dragging you down with me." When Sebastian read those words aloud in an interview, he cried on camera for the first time in decades. For years, he had built an image of his father as an absolute monster. But those letters revealed something far more complicated: that Pablo did understand what he had done, that he knew he had destroyed his own children, but that it was already too late to stop. Sebastian then confessed something devastating: that for years he too had hated his father deeply, that there were nights when he cursed the day he was born, when he wished 1,000 times he had never been Escobar's son. But he also admitted something more complex: that despite everything, he still remembered the good moments. When Pablo took him to the zoo, when he taught him to ride a bike, when he sat on his bed at night and told him made-up stories about pirates and adventurers. Then Sebastian revealed something no one expected, something that completely shifted the global narrative about the Escobar family. In 2020, he received an anonymous envelope. Inside were documents, recently declassified U.S. government files, and those documents revealed something shocking. The CIA had known exactly where the Escobar family was during all their years in hiding. They had tracked them relentlessly, every movement, every country, every attempt to seek asylum. But the most disturbing part wasn't that they were being watched, it was why. According to the documents, the CIA believed Juan Pablo, now Sebastian, had information about hidden caches of money, hundreds of millions of dollars buried in various countries. They assumed that eventually the son would try to recover that money, and the moment he did, they planned to track him and confiscate everything. For years, while Sebastian believed he was building a new life in Argentina, while he believed he had finally found peace, U.S. agents were following him, photographing him, tapping his phones, investigating every bank transaction, not just his mother's too. They even tried to locate Manuela, although she had vanished so completely that not even they could find her. Sebastian was shattered when he read those documents. It meant that the paranoia he had carried for years was not paranoia at all. It was reality. Every time he felt someone was following him, someone probably was. His survival instincts, the ones he had worked so hard to silence in therapy, had been right all along. But there was something else in those documents, something that filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in decades. They revealed that the U.S. government had actively sabotaged several attempts by the family to settle in different countries. When Brazil considered granting them asylum, the CIA pressured the Brazilian government economically. When South Africa showed interest in accepting them, U.S. agents leaked information to local media to create panic. Even in Argentina, where they finally found refuge, there were attempts to expel them, stopped only because the Argentine government refused to bow to pressure. In other words, the suffering of the Escobar family during those years of exile wasn't just the result of Pablo's actions. It had been deliberately prolonged and amplified by governments who wanted to use them as bait, keeping them desperate, vulnerable, hoping their desperation would push them to make a mistake, to seek hidden money, to contact old cartel members, to do anything that would justify arresting them and confiscating whatever assets they supposedly had. Sebastian decided to do something dangerous with that information. He made it public. He wrote a detailed article exposing everything he had discovered. The world reacted unpredictably. Some accused him of playing the victim, of trying to wash the Escobar name by blaming others, but others began asking uncomfortable questions. Was it ethical to hunt children for the crimes of their father? Where were the limits of justice? At what point does justice become cruelty? Then something extraordinary happened. Other cases began to emerge. Children of drug lords from around the world came forward. Sons of Mexican cartel leaders, Italian mafiosi, African warlords, all with the same story: constant persecution, illegal surveillance, sabotaged attempts to rebuild their lives, and all living in silence, afraid to speak because they believed no one would believe them. Suddenly, Sebastian became a voice for all of them. Messages started arriving from everywhere, from people who had never committed crimes yet lived punished for their parents' sins. And he realized something. His story wasn't unique, it was systemic. There was an entire invisible population of people marked from birth by last names they never chose. So he created something, a nonprofit called Children of Conflict. Its mission was to provide legal, psychological, and social support to children of criminals trying to build legitimate lives, to help them navigate systems that saw them as guilty by default, to connect them with therapists specialized in generational trauma, but most importantly, to give them community, a place where they could speak freely without being judged. The organization grew rapidly. In 2 years, it had offices in 12 countries. It had helped more than 300 people obtain new legal identities, prevented at least 50 unjust deportations, and begun changing laws. In 3 countries, new legislation was passed to protect family members of criminals who had never participated in illegal activity. But not everything was positive. The organization also attracted unwanted attention. Victims groups accused it of protecting criminals. Governments investigated it for possible money laundering. There were threats, many threats, against Sebastian, his staff, and even the people seeking help. Then in 2022, something happened that put everything into perspective. A 23-year-old Mexican man, the son of a Sinaloa cartel leader, was murdered. He had been working with Sebastian's organization. He was studying engineering. He had zero connection to his father's criminal world. But hitmen found him and killed him, not because he posed a threat, but because he carried a last name someone wanted erased. Sebastian attended the funeral, and there, standing before the coffin of a young man he had never met but whose story he knew intimately, he made a decision. He would no longer work quietly in the shadows. He would use his platform, his name, his story to force a global conversation about inherited guilt, the limits of responsibility, and when the punishment of one generation must end so the next can live. He began speaking at the United Nations, the European Parliament, universities around the world. His message was always the same. I'm not asking you to forget what my father did. I'm asking you not to punish his children for it. I'm not asking forgiveness for him. I'm asking justice for us, because nowhere in the penal codes of the world is someone punished for their last name, except in practice, except in the invisible reality we live every day. And people began to listen, slowly, uncomfortably, but they listened, because Sebastian wasn't defending criminals. He was defending their children, and that was a distinction many had never considered. Then in 2023, something happened no one saw coming. Manuela broke her silence. After nearly 30 years without giving a single interview, without appearing in any media, without speaking publicly about her experience, she agreed to do one interview, and only one, with a journalist she trusted. What she said changed everything. Manuela revealed that during all those years, she had not simply been hiding. She had been working as a psychologist, specialized in childhood trauma, under a false name. She had helped hundreds of children who had lived through violence, abuse, abandonment, children carrying their own cursed last names, their own impossible histories. I couldn't speak about my story, she said, but I could use what I learned from it to help others. Every child I treated, every story I listened to, healed a small part of me. It wasn't my brother who saved me. It was them, those children who never knew who I really was, but taught me that trauma doesn't have to be your destiny. You can turn your pain into purpose. The interview went viral. Millions watched it. What struck people most wasn't the revelation of her work. It was her presence, her voice, the calmness in her eyes. She wasn't the broken child the world imagined. She had healed, quietly, deliberately, on her own terms. Then Manuela said something that left the world speechless. My father once told me, when I was 7, that the happiest day of his life was the day I was born. He said that when he first saw me, he knew there was finally something in the world more important than his empire. And I often wonder, why wasn't that knowledge enough to stop him? Why wasn't loving us a good enough reason to stop destroying lives? And after 30 years, I found only one answer. Some people are incapable of saving themselves. They can love, they can feel, they can recognize what they're losing, but they cannot stop. And those are the most tragic monsters because they know exactly what they are doing, and they do it anyway. Those words resonated more deeply than anything Sebastian had ever said because they came from someone who had never sought attention, never asked for sympathy, never tried to sell her truth. Her honesty was powerful precisely because it was not performative. After that interview, Manuela disappeared again. No more interviews, no book deals, no joining her brother's organization. She simply went back to her private life. But she had shown something essential, that there is more than one way to heal. Not everyone needs a stage. Silence can also be a form of resistance. Sebastian, inspired by his sister's courage, finally did something he had postponed for years. He wrote a second book, not about his father, but about what came after. About 30 years of trying to build a life on ruins, about mistakes he made, people he hurt in his process of healing, relationships he destroyed because he didn't know how to love without fear. The book was called After the Monster, A Life in Reconstruction, and it was brutally honest in ways his first book wasn't. He wrote about episodes of such deep depression he considered suicide, about how his marriage nearly collapsed because he couldn't trust anyone fully, about how for years he was an emotionally absent father because he was so terrified of becoming Pablo that he became the opposite, distant, cold, unable to show affection. He wrote about the addictions he developed, not to drugs, ironically, but to work, to staying busy every second of the day so the thoughts wouldn't come, the memories, the weight. He wrote about sabotaging relationships because the moment someone got too close, he found a reason to push them away. Because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trusting that your truth won't be used against you. And he admitted something he had never said publicly, that there were times he considered revenge. Not physical revenge, but revealing secrets, names of people who betrayed his father, locations of money he did know about, information he could have used as currency or weapon. And the only thing that stopped him wasn't moral purity, it was the fear of becoming the very thing he had spent decades trying not to be. The book was controversial because it was too honest. Many people didn't want that kind of humanity. They wanted a simple story of redemption, an innocent victim who always made the right choices. But Sebastian was no longer interested in pleasing anyone. He was interested in the truth, and the truth was messy, contradictory, uncomfortable. Today, Sebastian is 47, Manuela is 40. They have lived more than 3 decades without their father, and even though the world still associates them with Pablo Escobar, they have built identities far beyond that shadow. Sebastian is an architect, activist, father, husband. Manuela is a psychologist, healer, quiet guardian of her own peace. But there is something they both understand. They will never be completely free. The Escobar name will follow them to their graves. Their own children, even with different last names, will eventually learn the truth. And when that moment comes, they will face impossible conversations, questions with no satisfying answers, a legacy they didn't choose but must somehow navigate. Sebastian's children are already old enough to ask questions. He has told them the truth gradually, in age-appropriate pieces, but eventually he showed them photos of their grandfather, explained who he was, what he did, and why their father carries a different last name. Their reactions were devastating in their simplicity. His eldest daughter, 15, once asked him, "If you could choose, would you have preferred not to be born?" Sebastian was speechless, because the honest answer was complicated. There were days when yes, when the pain was so immense he wished he didn't exist. But there were also days when he looked at his children, at the lives he had helped save through his organization, at the victims who had forgiven him, and wondered if maybe his existence had a purpose, if maybe all that agony meant something. He finally answered, "I don't know, and I think it's okay not to know. But I do know this. Now that I'm here, I choose to make my life matter. I can't change how I entered this world, but I can choose what I do with the time I have in it." His younger son, 12, reacted differently. After learning the full truth about his grandfather, he refused to speak to Sebastian for weeks. He felt betrayed, as if he had been lied to his entire life. And in a way he had. Not through outright lies, but through omissions, curated truths, protective silences his father thought were best. But the boy didn't see it that way. To him, it was a lie by omission. It was Manuela who finally helped resolve that conflict. She traveled from where she had been living, something she rarely did, and spoke with her nephew. No one knows exactly what she told him. Sebastian wasn't present during their conversation, but after 2 hours behind a closed door, his son emerged with red, tearful eyes, hugged his father for the first time in weeks, and said, "Aunt Manuela told me that we all carry things we didn't choose, and that what matters isn't where you come from, but where you're going." That simple, profound sentence captured exactly what both siblings had learned after decades of struggle, that origins are not destiny, that you can be born in the worst possible place and still build something beautiful. But they also understood something darker, that this construction never ends, that every generation will have to deal with the echo of Pablo Escobar in some form, weaker with time maybe, but still present. Then in 2024, something happened that no one anticipated. A grandson of Pablo Escobar, Sebastian's son, was bullied at school. Some classmates discovered who his grandfather was and began calling him narco-grandson, making cruel jokes about drugs and isolating him socially. The boy was 13. He didn't know how to handle it. Sebastian went to the school and requested a meeting with the bully's parents. And during that meeting, something extraordinary happened. One of the fathers stood up and said, "My brother died in the DAS bombing. He was 28. He was going to get married that month, and Pablo Escobar killed him. So excuse me if I don't feel sympathy for your situation." Sebastian looked at him and instead of defending himself replied, "You're absolutely right. My father murdered your brother, and there is no forgiveness in the world that can fix that. But my son didn't kill anyone. My son wasn't even born when your brother died. And if we punish him for my last name, if we punish your children for what I carry, where does it end? In which generation do we decide guilt stops?" The man fell silent. After a long moment, he said something that surprised everyone in the room. "I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Because when I look at your son, part of me sees just a kid, but another part sees the last name, sees Pablo's face and his features, and I feel rage, and I don't know how to separate those two things." His brutal honesty opened a conversation that lasted for hours. The other parents began sharing their own experiences with the violence of the drug war, how it had affected them, how they lost relatives, friends, their sense of safety. And Sebastian listened. He didn't justify anything. He didn't minimize their pain. He just listened. And when they finished, he said, "I can't return what my father took from you, but I can make sure my son doesn't become another victim of his violence. Because that's what's happening here. My father is still taking lives, still destroying families, only now he does it through the hate he left behind." Those words resonated, and although not everyone forgave, some never would, something shifted. A recognition that the cycle had to break somewhere, that if they didn't break it, their children would carry the same hate, and their grandchildren after them. And the violence would continue, in new forms, just as destructive. The bullying didn't disappear completely, but it diminished. And more importantly, Sebastian's son learned something fundamental, that the world would never be entirely fair to him, that he would carry a diluted but very real version of his grandfather's weight. But he also learned that he had a choice in how to respond. He could let it define him, or he could build something of his own despite it. Meanwhile, something unexpected emerged in Manuela's story. In 2025, one of her former patients, now an adult, published an article. The woman had been treated by Manuela at age 12 after witnessing her father's murder in a drug-related vendetta. And in the article, she revealed something extraordinary. The therapist who saved her life was Pablo Escobar's daughter. "I didn't know for years," she wrote. "To me, she was simply Dr. Marquez, the kind woman who let me cry in her office, who taught me breathing exercises when panic attacks paralyzed me, who helped me understand that what I saw didn't define me. And when I eventually learned who she really was, years after finishing therapy, my first reaction was disbelief. How could the daughter of the man whose violence destroyed my family be the same person who helped me heal from that violence?" The article continued. "I sought her out. I needed answers. And when we met, I asked her, 'Why did you never tell me? Why hide your identity?' Her answer was simple but devastating. 'Because if I had told you, you never would have let me help you. And you needed help. And I needed to give it to you. Not to redeem myself, not to cleanse my father's name, but because I understand your pain in a way few people can. And that understanding, that empathy born of shared trauma, was the only thing I had to offer you.'" The revelation caused a media storm. Reporters from all over the world tried to locate Manuela, wanting interviews, access, stories, but she refused. Every request was declined. Instead, she released one short, final public statement. "I have devoted my life to helping victims of trauma, many of them direct or indirect victims of drug-related violence. I worked in silence because silence was necessary for that work to be effective. Had my patients known who I was, they would have seen Pablo Escobar's daughter before seeing their therapist. And I wouldn't blame them. But I could not have helped them. Now that my identity is public, my work in this field is over. Not because I'm ashamed of who I am, but because I understand my presence would now be a distraction, a reminder of pain instead of a path to healing. I will retire from clinical practice, but not from the work. I will simply find another way." And she did. Manuela used the savings she had accumulated over years, living modestly despite having access to considerable resources, to open a free mental health clinic. She didn't put her name on it. She didn't appear in any of its materials. She was simply an anonymous benefactor. But the clinic specialized in helping victims of drug-related violence, and in its first year, it supported more than 500 people. When Sebastian learned what his sister had done, he felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride because she had turned her pain into purpose. Sadness because even after 3 decades, even after everything they had built, the Escobar name was still capable of destroying things. It had destroyed the secret career Manuela had spent years building. It had exposed her refuge. It had forced yet another reinvention. But when he spoke to her on the phone that night, her voice wasn't defeated. She sounded calm. "Maybe it was time," she told him. "Maybe I had been hiding too much. Not from others, but from myself. And now that I can't hide anymore, I have to find another way to live. And that's okay. I've faced worse." Her words stayed with Sebastian. They captured something fundamental about their lives, that there would always be another crisis, another moment when the past returned to destroy what they had built. But that destruction no longer defined them. What defined them was how they responded to it, their ability to rebuild, to adapt, to continue. In recent years, something else has begun to shift. The global narrative about Pablo Escobar. For decades, he was treated almost as a mythical figure. Netflix series glamorized him. Films portrayed him as an anti-hero. Tourists flocked to Medellin seeking Escobar experiences. Every time that happened, Sebastian and Manuela felt a knife twist inside, but resistance began to grow. Victims groups started protesting the romanticization of narco-culture. Medellin launched campaigns to redefine itself, not as Escobar's city, but as a reborn hub of innovation. And for the first time, the voices of survivors began to drown out the world's morbid fascination. Sebastian joined these efforts, not as a leader, but as an ally. He knew it wasn't his place to be at the forefront. The voices that needed to lead were the victims themselves, but he could amplify them. He could use his international platform to make sure the right stories were told. And slowly, painfully slowly, the narrative began to change. Fewer shows glorifying drug lords, more documentaries about victims, less narco-tourism, more historical memory tourism, visiting museums honoring the dead, not the man who killed them. Then in 2025, the Colombian government did something symbolic but profoundly meaningful. They demolished the last remaining property associated with Pablo Escobar. Hacienda Nápoles, once turned into a theme park, would finally become a memorial, not to Pablo, but to his victims. Every person killed during his reign would have their name engraved on a wall. Their stories would be told, their lives honored. Sebastian was invited to the inauguration ceremony. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life, because attending would mean supporting the destruction of a place tied to his childhood. The zoo where he played, the gardens where he ran, some of the few happy memories he had of his father. But he also knew those memories could never be more important than honoring the dead. So he went, and when he was asked to speak, he stepped onto the stage, looked at the sea of faces, victims, families, survivors, and said, "I'm not here to talk about my father. Enough has been said about him. I'm here to talk about you, about the names that will be carved into this wall, about the lives that were cut short, about pain that should never have existed." For years, the world was obsessed with the man who caused that pain. They gave him shows, books, movies. They turned his story into entertainment. And every time they did that, you were forgotten. Your stories were not told, your names were not spoken, and that is an injustice I cannot repair. But I can be here today. I can say your names. I can remember. And I can make sure that my son and his children know that the only story that matters from that era is not the story of the man who destroyed, but the story of the people who were destroyed and of those who survived despite everything. The silence afterward was absolute. Then slowly, some people began to applaud. Not all. Some stood and left, unable to tolerate his presence. And Sebastian understood. He accepted it, because forgiveness cannot be bought with a speech. Some wounds run too deep, and that's okay. Not everyone has to forgive for healing to be possible. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached him, perhaps 70 years old. She introduced herself as the mother of a police officer killed by Escobar's orders. Sebastian braced himself, expecting insults, accusations, rejection. But instead, the woman hugged him, tightly, for a long time. And when she finally pulled away, there were tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for remembering my son, for saying his name, for acknowledging that he existed. That's all a mother asks. Not revenge, not justice, just that her child be remembered." In that moment, Sebastian felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, but real. A brief quiet in the chaos of his life. A moment where the weight felt a little lighter. A moment where he believed, truly believed, that maybe everything he had done, everything he had endured, had been worth it. That night, he called Manuela and told her about the ceremony, the woman, the peace he felt. Manuela stayed silent for a long time before finally saying, You know what I've learned? That redemption isn't a destination you reach. It's a path you walk. Some days you move forward. Some days you move backward. Some days you just sit in the middle of the road and cry. And all those days are valid. All are part of the process. You don't need to arrive anywhere specific for your life to matter. You just have to keep walking. Those words became Sebastian's mantra. He repeated them whenever things got hard, whenever he felt he wasn't doing enough, whenever the weight returned with full force. Just keep walking. Not toward a specific goal, not toward a redemption that may never fully come. Just forward, one step at a time. Today in 2025, 32 years after Pablo Escobar's death, his children continue that path. Sebastian is 48. Manuela is 41. They have lived longer without their father than with him, and the world keeps evolving in how it relates to that story. Younger generations in Colombia are less obsessed with Escobar. For them, he is history, not a living memory. And that is good. It means the country is healing. It means it is leaving behind that dark era. And although Sebastian and Manuela will never fully escape it, at least they can live in a world that is learning to. Sebastian continues with his organization. He has helped more than 1,000 people rebuild their lives, changed laws in 8 countries, trained hundreds of therapists in generational trauma. And although the work will never be finished, although there will always be more people to help, he has learned to find satisfaction in progress, not perfection. Manuela continues her work in quieter ways. Her clinics, now 3 locations, provide care to more than 2,000 people a year. She never appears publicly, but those who work there know who she is, and they respect her. Not because of her name, but despite it. Both siblings have found love. Sebastian has been married for 20 years. They've had ups and downs, moments where his trauma nearly destroyed the marriage, but they survived. They learned to communicate, to ask for help, to build a relationship grounded in brutal honesty instead of mutual protection. Manuela also married, though few know that. Her husband understands her need for privacy, respects her past without letting it define her, loves her for who she is, not for who her father was. Together they have built a quiet, private, deeply meaningful life. And their children, the 3rd generation, are growing up now. The grandchildren of Pablo Escobar, bearing different surnames, living lives separate from that legacy. But one day they too will face their version of the story. They'll read articles, watch documentaries, hear whispers, and when that day comes, Sebastian and Manuela will be there to explain, to contextualize, to make sure these children understand that their family story is complex, that there were victims and victimizers, that their grandfather caused unimaginable harm, but that they are not responsible for it. They can acknowledge the past without carrying its weight. They can honor the victims without destroying themselves, because that is the final lesson the siblings have learned. You can carry a terrible story without letting that story carry you. You can recognize the past without being trapped by it. You can be the child of a monster and still choose to be human. The children of Pablo Escobar never chose their destiny. They never chose that family, that world, that cursed last name. Yet they paid for it every day in ways most people could never understand. Some, like Manuela, fled the past, seeking peace in anonymity and silent work. Others, like Sebastian, confronted it, seeking redemption through recognition and action. But both discovered something essential, something everyone marked by generational trauma eventually learns. No last name, no matter how powerful, can buy true peace. No fortune, no matter how vast, can erase the damage left by corrupt power. They survived. But more than that, they learned to live, to find meaning in the pain, to build purpose on ruins, to transform trauma into tools that help others. And that transformation, that daily choice to walk toward the light instead of the darkness, is perhaps the deepest form of redemption that exists. Not a redemption that erases the past, but one that acknowledges it, faces it, and still chooses to build something new. So if you believe there are still truths buried in the shadows of power, truths about inherited pain and how it can be transformed, about cycles of violence and how they can be broken, about healing that becomes possible even when it feels impossible, These stories exist everywhere, in families marked by impossible names, in people carrying weights they never asked for, and their stories must be told not to glorify suffering, but to illuminate the path toward healing. Because the most important lesson Pablo Escobar's children can offer the world isn't about how an empire fell, but how a life worth living can be built on its ruins.